free-for-all. Green light, green light.
Things where people are now aware of that the internet has sort of started to equalize the playing field in terms of removing ignorance. And so this is another thing that corporations have benefited a lot from, which is like, preying essentially on ignorance. So like if my workers don't know what else is out there, I can give them crappy things. So in general, like I think, for example, the quality of food has thankfully in restaurants, like generally speaking, improved over the course of my life. And why is that? It's because now I have so much access to information about where I can get food and where there's good food and where there's bad food. As a result, there were a lot of crappy restaurants that, existed when I grew up that like I didn't realize that I could drive 10 minutes away or further and find a really good restaurant. That was amazing. It was all like word of mouth. But with the advent of internet sharing information, I've been able to find good restaurants. As we sort of discover there are better restaurants and worse restaurants, like better companies and worse companies, people have started gravitating towards the better companies and moving away from the worse companies. So I think a lot of corporations have continued to exist very profitably, basically preying on the ignorance of their employees and their employees not realizing what else is out there. So there are a couple of other things that have happened recently, and I think the biggest one is COVID. So I think COVID has been a great example of the blindfold coming off. So for a long time, companies have sort of assumed or believed or taught their employees to believe that particular things were true. The first is that you have to be at the office to work, right? So what companies would do is like there's so much crap that people had to put up with, like commuting is the top of the list, right? Where like you had to commute, like a commute was a given. So when looking at a job, I even remember when I got my first place in Boston, or not just first place, every single place I had in Boston, one of the main considerations I had when I was like renting an apartment was, what does my commute look like? What does the commute look like? What does the commute look like? What does the commute look like? Because people were spending half an hour or up to an hour, depending on where you live and what your situation is, or 5 minutes if you're super lucky. People would spend anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours of their life per day commuting to and from work. And so what's happened with COVID is we sort of started to realize, you actually don't need to commute to work. Like you don't actually have to be at the office. And this was a huge revelation for a lot of people, right? So the other thing that corporations didn't take advantage of was almost like geographical predation, where in the past, your job options were restricted by your geography. So if I live in like Beaumont, Texas, or if I live in like some small town in Alabama, or if I live in some small town in India, my only options for work were like available around me. And so with the advent of the internet, and especially with COVID and work from home, you're no longer geographically restricted. So there used to be some companies that I don't know if you guys have ever heard of a company town where there's like one major employer and most of the people work for that employer, and people don't have a lot of choice. They don't have a lot of ability to laterally move or go to other companies. With the advent of COVID and everything moving online, suddenly now corporations are no longer able to engage in essentially geographical predation, right? So now if I don't like the job that I have in Mobile, Alabama, I can go and apply for a job in Canada, right? So I can actually work in a different country. I can work in a different part of the state. This is something that corporations have loved doing for a long time until it starts to hurt them, which is when there was all this concern about, shipping jobs overseas or outsourcing to places like India and China. And companies have been thrilled to do that thus far. We've moved manufacturing over to China. We've moved manufacturing over to India, and people have lost their jobs here. Like corporations have been great. I can move elsewhere. I don't actually have to employ the people here. And now what's happening is the reverse, right? So where employees are starting to realize, I actually don't have to work for this crap job with you. I can actually work remotely and somewhere else. And so this has been a huge thing that COVID has sort of unveiled, and I think companies are now reeling from it. Next thing that COVID has revealed is what they need to survive. So there used to be a huge idea about what was required for survival, success, and happiness in life, right? This is the idea of the grind. people are like grinding left and right, and it's like, I'm going to grind, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to become successful, I'm going to make more money, and then I can retire at the age of 65. I'm going to commute 2 hours of my life every day to work 9 hours a day. So it's going to be an 11-hour commitment per day. I'm going to sleep for 8 hours, which gives me like 2 hours a day of recreation or whatever. I'm going to do this for about 40 years, and I'm going to retire, and I'm going to buy a condo somewhere where it's warm and where there's a beach, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of my life. And this was accepted. This was just sort of like what, people used to be okay with. And there's sort of this like idea that, the harder you work, the more successful you're going to be. And then essentially what the corporations did is took all the hardworking people and like predated them to extinction. And so they essentially there's this idea that you have to grind really hard and then you'll be happy at the end. And what tends to happen instead, like during COVID, is people started to realize, like, what is the value of time? What is the value of my time? What do I actually need to survive? And what I think what people really discovered is that they don't need money nearly as much as they thought they did. And that an extra $5,000 a year, $10,000 a year is not worth an extra 15 hours a week. So as COVID has taken the blindfold off, a lot of people have started to re-question their priorities and what they're willing to sacrifice. So just kind of stepping into evolutionary theory for a second. So I think that basically like COVID has put a selection pressure on jobs, right? So this is where like before these behaviors and practices by companies went on unchecked because there was no consequence in the environment. So, the theory of evolution says survival of the fittest, and since companies were able to get away with that sort of thing, they did get away with it because there was no consequence for them. And now what I think corporations are really discovering is that there's actually a selection pressure, which is what's happening, right? So workers en masse are deciding to select for a particular kind of job and select against another kind of job. And this is where a lot of people are starting to get really upset, and they're saying there's a labor shortage. There's not a labor shortage, there's a wage shortage, right? The labor is there. It's just, it doesn't want to work your crappy job, which you've been able to propagate for a long time and haven't had to up to snuff because, like, there's been no selection pressure against it, right? So these companies have become, like, bloated, profit-driven, and I'm not, like, a leftist, by the way. I'm just saying that if there's no, like, selection pressure against something, it's going to become bloated and, like, overblown and, like, the wealth inequality is increasing and people are just not going to put up with it anymore. And so what we're sort of seeing, there's some really sort of simple evidence I'm going to draw up here. But that basically, if you want to like play a game with someone, you have to let them win at least 30% of the time. So if you look at like play behavior amongst animals, and even if you think about like this game, for example, like you've got to let them win some of the time, right? Like a 30-70 win. If they lose more than 70% of the time, they're going to stop playing. If they win 70% of the time, they're going to significantly more than 70% of the time, they're going to stop playing. So if you even think about the way that video games are designed, video games are not designed to be like 100% victory all the time, right? They sort of are, but they give you like false starts. You have to wipe on a boss multiple times before you down it. And so what's been happening for far too long is that like companies have been racking up W's without taking L's. And now like their karmic seed is coming to fruition where people just aren't willing to put up with it anymore. And so like now what's happening is they've created these systems that have become essentially bloated and vulnerable to this kind of like essentially like workers hitting back, right? And I know this is starting to sound like the Communist Manifesto, but I mean, it's really more about psychology and evolutionary theory. I'm not suggesting one is good or one is bad. It's just, this is what happened. There have been too many unchecked corporate excesses, and like people are just tired of it now. So there's another huge thing that's starting to change a little bit, which I think I've worked with a lot of startups. I've worked with a lot of CEOs. I've worked with a lot of investment banks, and I've started to see some interesting changes in those places. So the first example that I'll show is that working at an investment bank like Goldman Sachs or like JP Morgan or whatever used to be a very coveted job. And now what tends to happen is people want to do their 2 years at a place like Goldman and they quickly as possible. So this is kind of interesting and this is not just something that's happening at the bottom tier of like wage, right? This is even happening very high up. You see this a lot in medicine. You see it a lot in residency, where people are starting to decide like, I'm not going to become a doctor. I can become a nurse practitioner because I can make way more. I can make sure I'll make less money, but the amount of time that I have to sacrifice to become a doctor is no longer worth
Enemy
it. So I'm
spy
going to
plane
go the MP
eliminated.
route. So we're seeing this at so many different levels of work. I absolutely see this as a thing where I had a very prominent client who was struggling with turnover. And so, what they sort of had this attitude that it's like, you work hard and like you invest, you pay your dues. And then once you rise to the top, that's when you get to relax.